When Charles Dickens, not quite 30 years old, arrived in the United States for his first visit to the country in 1842, his fame preceded him. The success of his Pickwick papers and Oliver Twist, and especially the Old Curiosity Shop, had made him wildly popular in America, and Americans flocked to see him. He was feted in cities and towns as he traveled the country. He encountered American technological advances such as canals and railroads, and even a system which combined both. He traveled by stage, omnibus, rail, and steamboat. He visited hospitals and prisons, warehouses and workhouses, and toured the largest cities and small rural towns. Along the way he observed American manners and behavior, political gatherings and patriotic celebrations, lectures and church services. Little escaped his eye less his pen. When his observations were produced in print in the fall of 1842, his popularity in the United States plummeted due to his acidic comments over some areas of American society. Yet he also extolled some aspects of America and its technological prowess. His condemnation of slavery was itself condemned in the American South, and he expressed concern at the levels of violence he observed throughout his trip. Here is the story of his remarkable tour of America in 1842. The trip was for both business and pleasure. When Dickens arrived in the United States, disembarking in Boston in January 1842, he had several plans for his stay. He wanted to inspect facilities for prisoners, the mentally ill and the poor, expecting to find them in a better state than those to be found in England. He was particularly interested in institutions for the blind, deaf and mute. Schools and libraries were also of interest. He was at first astounded by the reception in America. Crowds cheered him upon arrival and followed him about Boston streets, whenever he ventured forth. He soon found the constant adulation intrusive and annoying. He also found his work available in shops and from street vendors. Charles Dickens wrote his early novels in serial form, publishing them chapter by chapter in periodicals. This allowed him to respond to feedback from readers as the story slowly unfolded. The Old Curiosity Shop crossed the Atlantic to the United States one chapter at a time, and crowds formed as ships docked, calling out for details from the latest chapter. They were immediately published by multiple newspapers and magazines in the United States, and later in bound volumes. In the absence of international copyright agreements, Dickens received not a penny for U.S. sales of his work. He intended to argue for international copyright protection during his sojourn in America. Boston was Dickens' favorite city in America, according to American Notes. Dickens was as impressed with Boston as Boston was with its visitor. He stayed in the famous Parker House Hotel, which at the time called itself the most modern hotel in the world. During his stay in Boston, he visited the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, one of the first company towns in America. The mills, factories, and canals were built by mostly immigrant labor, and the mills themselves were staffed by young women called mill girls, who were also housed by the companies in Lowell. Mill girls were charged for their room and board by their employer, leaving just over half of their daily pay for their personal use. Most came from rural New England communities. Dickens wholeheartedly approved of the working conditions in the factories and mills. He found the recreational pursuits offered by the employers, which included music, reading libraries, and a Lowell newspaper which was widely read, all laudable. He observed that none of the workers were forced there by debt or apprenticeship, which bound them to their looms, noting, for these girls, often the daughters of small farmers, come from other states, remain a few years in the mills, and then go home for good. Dickens obliquely compared the conditions in the Lowell mills to those of England, calling it the good and evil. Dickens found New England much to his liking. Dickens, who was traveling with his wife and her maid as companions, was pleased by what he saw in New England, including the rural towns he passed while traveling to Hartford. His stop there featured a visit to an insane asylum, about which he commented favorably over the humanity shown its patients. He also observed the city jail and remarked it was the best jail for untried offenders in the world. He made similar observations regarding the state prison in the city. Nearly all he encountered in New England he compared favorably to similar institutions in Great Britain. He also made his first observations of American manners and national quirks. When questioning a guard at the state prison in Hartford, his query was at first answered with, "Well, I don't know." Dickens wryly added in an aside, which by the by is a national answer. From Hartford he stopped briefly at New Haven, where he inspected Yale College's elm-shaded campus. In New Haven he boarded a steamer named New York, bound for the city of that name. The city left a less favorable impression. "The beautiful metropolis of America is by no means so clean a city as Boston," he wrote, describing areas of the city as equal to the notorious slums of London, in respect of filth and wretchedness. In his travels in New England, he mentioned not a single slum. Dickens found jail conditions in New York appalling in 1842. In New York City, Dickens visited the city jail known then it is today as the Tombs. One of his many questions to the guard who served as his guide was how that name had been arrived at, to which he received the aforementioned national answer in reply. In the Tombs, Dickens found men locked into tiny windowless cells, behind solid iron doors, where they remained 24 hours a day, with no opportunity for exercise or even sunlight. Most were awaiting trial, and some of the prisoners remained in such conditions for up to a year or more. Included in the cells in the same manner were prisoners in protective custody, such as witnesses for upcoming trials. Dickens observed that in Great Britain, if a man be under sentence of death, even he has air and exercise at certain periods of the day. Besides the prison, Dickens described mid-19th century New York as dirty, with swine roaming freely in the streets, often past shops where whole slaughtered hogs hung in windows. After obtaining an escort of 2 policemen, Dickens ventured into the area of 5 Points, one of the worst slums of the city. In his words, "A squalid square of leprous houses, all that is loathsome, drooping, and decayed is here." The tour through the slums led back to the Tombs, where prisoners awaiting morning magistrate courts were held overnight in basement cells, crawling with rats. Dickens viewed the educational systems in New York with approval. In New York, Dickens toured a facility offered by the city government, known as the Refuge for the Destitute. He compared it most favorably to a London which produced, in his imagination, characters such as Bill Sikes and the Artful Dodger. It was an institution whose object is to reclaim youthful offenders, male and female, black and white without distinction, to teach them useful trades, apprentice them to respectable masters, and make them worthy members of society. Dickens thought highly of the means through which the institution was administered, though he questioned the efficiency of treating young women, familiar with the streets, as if they were somehow once again little girls. Dickens found the educational facilities of the city to be excellent, and said so without the savage wit he applied to other institutions. For example, he called the city's fire department admirable, before adding, as indeed it should be, having constant practice. Dickens' primary reason for being in New York on his first visit there, he would return later in his tour, was to arrange for reservations for passage home late in the spring. From New York he began the travels across the United States which carried him west to St. Louis, south into slave-holding Virginia, and to many sights and sounds in between. He was able to observe and record the many different perceptions Americans held of themselves and their place in the world in 1842. Dickens traveled to Philadelphia by train and ferry. Travel in the America of 1842 was through several modes of conveyance, with varying degrees of comfort afforded passengers. From New York to Philadelphia, Dickens chose the relatively new means of trains, a journey which required the use of ferries when water barriers were encountered. For Dickens and his party, the journey from New York to Philadelphia was a matter of between 5 and 6 hours. Unlike Boston, Hartford, and New York, the older sections of which were defined by winding, narrow, and crooked streets, Philadelphia had been planned by William Penn. It featured straight, broad avenues and streets, and buildings of stone and brick in its oldest quarters. Dickens toured another prison in Philadelphia, which kept its inmates in solitary confinement for the duration of their sentences, often for many years, though it also provided them with the tools of a trade to pass the time. He was unimpressed. From Philadelphia he embarked on a steamboat for the journey to Washington, D.C. On it he encountered a group of British expatriates working as farmers in America. Of all grades and kinds of men that jostle one in the public conveyances of the States, these are often the most intolerable, and the most insufferable companions, he wrote of his countrymen. Dickens was little impressed with the nation's capital on his visit. The Washington which was seen by Dickens little resembled the city he visited a second time in 1867. In 1842 the great dome of the Capitol building was not there. The city was one of great distances between its buildings and its parks. Wide avenues had little built alongside them. The hotel in which he stayed consisted of 7 small houses, each accommodating a guest or guests, rather than a single building with a lobby, and common rooms such as a saloon or restaurant. Dickens visited the Capitol every day either house was in session, and the White House twice. On the first visit he was introduced to President John Tyler. He recorded the president looked worn and anxious, and well he might, being at war with everybody. Everywhere Dickens looked in Washington, in the houses of Congress and lobbies and bank saloons and restaurants, he saw spittoons. He commented on the fact that while every male expectorated with frequency, few had learned to hit them. His disgust with the American habit of chewing tobacco and spitting, which increased with his journey to the South and later to the West, was unbridled. The use of tobacco was one reason he altered his plans while in Washington. He had originally planned to travel to South Carolina. In Washington he decided to go no further south than Richmond, Virginia, after which his party would venture to the west. The journey to Richmond was by steamboat, stage, and rail. Steamboats of the antebellum days are remembered as resembling in some ways a wedding cake, with several tiers of diminishing size rising from the base. Most steamers which carried passengers more resembled a barge. The most important thing they carried was cargo, manufactured goods heading south, and bales of cotton or cured tobacco to markets in the north. Passenger accommodations were often limited. In a great room, all of the male passengers slept, if at all on benches which lined the outer walls. Meals were shared at a common table in the center of the room. Deck space for exercise or taking the air was at a premium. It was on such a craft Dickens traveled south from Washington, until it reached the landing where the passengers transferred to stage coaches. The stages crossed muddy roads and forded creeks to Fredericksburg, Virginia, where the passengers again were obliged to change their means of conveyance to the railroad which covered the remaining distance to Richmond. Dickens passed fields devoid of planting, the soil exhausted by years of growing tobacco. The entire journey from Washington to Richmond took 17 hours, covering a distance of just over 100 miles. In Richmond, Dickens observed the workings of a tobacco processing plant and a plantation. In 1842, cotton was just beginning to surpass tobacco as the major crop of the Deep South. Though in Virginia tobacco still ruled, Dickens was able to tour a tobacco processing plant. "I saw in this place the whole process of picking, rolling, pressing, drying, packing in casks and branding," he wrote, noting that all of the workers in the manufactory were slaves. When the workers were released for their dinner, Dickens said several times that, "I should like to see them at their meal." But as the gentleman to whom I mentioned this desire appeared to be suddenly taken rather deaf, I did not pursue the request. Dickens visited a plantation outside Richmond the following day, and was welcomed by the owner at the main house. He then was escorted to the slave quarters, and viewed the slaves, though he was not allowed to enter any of the buildings in which they dwelt. After the brief visit to Richmond, Dickens returned to Washington by reversing his route, and from there went on to Baltimore, then one of the busiest harbors and ports in the United States. He took up residence in Barnum's Hotel, which he described as the best such establishment he encountered anywhere in the United States, not the least because it offered sufficient water for bathing. Baltimore was a brief period of rest before the Western sojourn began. Some of the problems of 19th-century travel were revealed in Dickens's activities. During his short stay in Baltimore, he reduced the amount of luggage being carried by himself and his party, after being advised that they would be a hindrance on conveyances to the West. What could be done without was shipped to New York to await his further instructions. Visits to banks were necessary, though Dickens of course carried some money in gold and silver. Letters of credit were issued to replenish funds along the way at the banking institutions to be encountered in faraway Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis. The route itself had already been selected. In 1842, most of the railroads in the United States ran east of the Alleghenies, or west of the range. The mountains themselves had not yet been breached. There was a way through them, which combined the use of canals and steam engines, and which Dickens used to cross the mountains and reach Pittsburgh. To avail himself of the system, he next traveled to York, Pennsylvania by train, where he transferred to stagecoach for the journey to Harrisburg. Another feature of travel of the day was his arrival at York in time for dinner at the hotel, which served as the stage stop. Dinner was covered by his fare for the journey to Harrisburg. Dickens described the canal boat as a barge with a little house on it. The canal boat on which Dickens traveled westward toward the mountains was crowded with passengers bound for Pittsburgh. The morning after departure from Harrisburg, they reached the Allegheny Portage Railroad. From his side of the railroad, the canal flowed back to Harrisburg. On the other side of the portage, a canal connected with Pittsburgh. The Allegheny Portage Railroad connected the two canals, shifting passengers and freight from one to the other. When Charles Dickens arrived at its base, it had been in operation for just 8 years, during which time it had become a tourist destination of its own. Dickens traversed the Alleghenies by leaving the canal boat and transferring to cars, which were pulled up the first of 5 inclines by a stationary steam engine. Upon reaching level, grade mules were attached to the cars, usually in trains of 2 or 3, and pulled to the next incline, where they were again attached to a steam engine for the next ascent. At the time Dickens used the railroad, the lines used to pull the cars were of hemp. Later in 1842 they were replaced with steel wires manufactured nearby by John Roebling. Roebling was already advocating the use of the steel wires in the construction of suspension bridges, for use by railroads and horse-drawn traffic. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was a short-lived convenience. The Allegheny Portage Railroad reversed the process to descend the mountain on the other side. Gravity pulled the cars down the inclines, braked by ropes attached to the steam engines. A total of 10 inclines were used to cross the mountain, 5 on each side. Upon reaching the base, the passengers, their luggage, and the freight being carried were transferred to another canal boat, for the journey to Pittsburgh in one direction, and Philadelphia in the other. Once wire ropes were installed, the passenger cars were discontinued, and the canal boats themselves ascended and descended the mountains, carried on articulated base rail cars. The Allegheny Portage Railroad and the canals reduced the travel time between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to as little as 3 days, and never more than 5. 10 years after Dickens crossed the mountain, the Pennsylvania Railroad traversed the Alleghenies, and the journey between the two cities was reduced to just over 12 hours. The Allegheny Portage Railroad operated year-round, 24 hours per day, for 20 years before the railroads made the canals, and its services crossing the mountains obsolete. During its lifetime, both stationary and locomotive engines carted passengers and freight across the mountains in what was a thrilling and unique experience in western Pennsylvania. On to Pittsburgh and the Ohio River, gateway to the west. After the experience of crossing the mountains, Dickens enjoyed another unusual aspect of the Pennsylvania canals. The approach to Pittsburgh was via a raised, curved aqueduct which he described as a vast low wooden chamber full of water which crossed the Allegheny River and delivered him to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh to Dickens's eye resembled Birmingham in England, not surprising since both cities were already known for their iron foundries. It certainly has a great quantity of smoke hanging about it, and is famous for its ironworks, he remarked. Pittsburgh was but a rest stop for Dickens, where he awaited steamboat passage down the Ohio River for his next destination of Cincinnati. Though western steamboats usually blow up 1 or 2 a week in the season, Dickens observed, deciding it was advisable to seek the services of a reputable boat and captain. Unknown to Dickens, most steamboats did not follow the schedule announced to passengers, often remaining docked long after their announced departure date. But this is the custom, for if the law were to bind down a free and independent citizen to keep his word with the public, what would become of the liberty of the subject, was the writer's comment on the matter. He was unaware that profits came from shipping freight, and boats did not leave their docks until all freight space was sold. Dickens made numerous comments about the hazards of steamboats. Aboard the boat which carried him to Cincinnati, Dickens was relieved to find he had been assigned a private cabin, with 2 berths, situated in the stern of the vessel. He was further relieved because he had been informed that, when boats blew up, usually from boiler explosions, they generally blew up forward. Dickens was not the first to observe that the upper works of the steamboats were constructed of wood, based above machinery under which fire burned visibly and fiercely, an especially sobering sight when passing one at night. Dickens also noted the relative inexperience of the crews which operated the machinery. The wonder is, not that there should be so many fatal accidents, but that any journey should be safely made, was a terse observation he recorded, though his journey was obviously a safe one. Boiler explosions and fires on the riverboats were fairly common, but the majority of journeys were made safely. Until the railroads made their way to the west, the rivers were the highways to the emerging cities, and commerce between Pittsburgh and New Orleans, including the cities and towns along the way, was brisk and profitable. The trip between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati in 1842 was accomplished in 3 days. Dickens encountered aspects of the American diet which displeased him. During the journey down the Ohio River, Dickens was pleased to learn that meals were served 3 times a day, but displeased with some of the dishes presented. One which earned his ire was cornbread, almost as good for the digestion as a kneaded pincushion. He was also unhappy with the only beverage offered at table being jugs of cold water. After nearly 3 months in America, he was beginning to chafe at the company of Americans. The people are all alike too. There is no diversity of character. They travel about on the same errands, say and do the same things in exactly the same manner, and follow in the same dull, cheerless round. His arrival at Cincinnati cheered him immensely. I have not often seen a place that commends itself so favorably and pleasantly to a stranger at the first glance as this does, he wrote of the city he called beautiful. He also noted the growing temperance movement in the city and its influence on the local government. He spent several days there observing the various and busy commerce along the riverfront, and the businesses taking root at the base of the hills, which ring the basin containing most of the city. Though he did not know it, he was at the place where Roebling would use his steel wires to bridge the Ohio River, beginning the project just over a decade later. Dickens continued on to Louisville and St. Louis. Dickens continued his journey to Louisville, where he stayed at the Galt House, which he praised highly before continuing on to St. Louis. On the river voyage he encountered aboard the steamboat a Choctaw Indian, who astonished the Englishman by sending in his calling card before visiting. Dickens had the same vision of the American Indians as most of Europe at the time, and the appearance of a chief of the Choctaw in gentleman's dress, with gentlemanly manners, was in stark contrast to that described of many of his fellow travelers. In both Louisville and St. Louis Dickens found the climate waning, and in the latter likely to be unhealthful, due to the humidity and the swampy nature of the terrain around it. Among the sights he observed there were the improvements done to the river by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which had been accomplished about 5 years earlier. They had redirected the river channel, ensuring deep water at the St. Louis waterfront, under the direction of an engineer named Robert E. Lee. Dickens returned to Cincinnati to begin a journey across Ohio. After he inspected St. Louis and its environs, which included a trip into Illinois to view an example of the American prairie, Dickens returned to Cincinnati. Along the way he visited Cairo, Illinois, which was later used for the basis of the fictional American town of Eaton in his novel Martin Chuzzlewit. His intentions were to travel to Sandusky on Lake Erie, then by water to Niagara, and thence to New York. The first leg of the journey from Cincinnati was to Columbus, a distance of about 120 miles, all of which were over a macadamized road. Such a road for such a length was relatively rare in 1842 America. Macadamizing was a process invented by a Scotsman, John Macadam, only 2 decades earlier. It consisted of several layers of pulverized stone being packed down upon each other, the stone dust binding the layers together. Macadamized roads were less liable to being cut into ruts from wheeled traffic when wet from heavy rains. Dickens left Cincinnati in a large stagecoach, which was forced to stop frequently to either water or change the horses, and which traveled at about 6 miles per hour, on average. Often the coachman changed as well, though according to Dickens, he is always dirty, sullen, and taciturn. The trip to Sandusky took several days. Feeding the passengers traveling the stagecoach lines was accomplished at inns and stops along the way, often coinciding with changing the horse, coaches, or coachmen. The influence of the temperance movement was again felt, with many of the inns being described as temperance houses by Dickens during the journey. From Columbus to Tiffin, Ohio, the road was not macadamized, and the advantages the system offered to passengers and coaches was obvious from the terrible condition of the new road. Dickens noted during the journey a sight, which was rare on the roads of England and the eastern United States. Tree stumps liberally dotted the landscape. Firewood was still the principal source of heat in rural areas, and lumber for building was easier had by cutting down a tree than shipping it from a lumber yard. He also noted the number of pigs which roved about freely, it being easier for farmers to allow the pigs to fend for themselves, scavenging for food, than it was to keep them penned and feed them while incurring costs. They were later driven to slaughter. The Ohio of 1842 was still home to a large population of Wyandot Indians, which were encountered by Dickens on his journey to Sandusky, and later described in detail. Dickens took a side trip to British Canada from Niagara. As have been most visitors to the falls at Niagara, Dickens was suitably impressed and said so. He then traveled through Canada, visiting Toronto, Kingston, Montreal, and Quebec, among other stops. From Montreal by steamboat and stage, he traveled to Albany and from there to New York, visiting the Shaker village at Lebanon on the way. His thoughts about the Shakers were obvious from his words on his departure, leaving the Shaker village with a hearty dislike of the old Shakers and a hearty pity for the young ones, and he returned to New York City, where he was again feted. He took another side trip to West Point, where he inspected the United States Military Academy, The school was at the time controversial in the United States. Congressional appointments were often suspected of being sold to wealthy families or awarded to political supporters. Several proposals were made in Congress to eliminate the academy, which had been created 40 years earlier during the presidential administration of Thomas Jefferson. Dickens confined his remarks to the site's historical significance and its great natural beauty. Dickens sailed for home and prepared to publish his observations of America. On June 7, 1842, after 5 months of travels in America and interactions with its inhabitants, Dickens embarked for the journey to Great Britain and home. Nearly all of his fellow passengers were immigrants who had arrived in America expecting to find its streets paved with gold, and had found it to be wanting. They were returning to Europe poorer than when they had begun their journey to the United States. All of them blamed their failure on the empty promises of the United States, rather than their arrival ill-equipped to engage in any trade or profession, according to Dickens. Dickens kept a journal during his travels across the United States. When he was invited, as he frequently was, to address various organizations during the trip, he for the most part confined his remarks to the issue of international copyright. He avoided aligning himself with the temperance movement, the abolitionist movement, the issue of a national bank, and other political and social issues which marked American society. Those comments he prepared, beginning on his voyage home for publication in his next work. When they were published, they rattled American society and cost him much of the goodwill he enjoyed during his tour.